Hey, everyone, and welcome to this podcast. We're continuing to look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison. And I'm up to a letter that is written to Bethge on June 27, 1944. And we've been talking about religionless Christianity. I've been using the phrase religionless faith and really looking at what Bonhoeffer believes Christianity will look like following World War II as it moves away from the institutions of the late 19th century, and as they get past this war where Christians have brutally kind of killed each other. And his argument is that faith has to look different, that people are no longer going to be interested in the old ways of speaking about God and speaking about faith. And so he's wrestling through what this is about. And so in this letter, what's interesting is he begins to talk about the Old Testament. So there was in a past letter, and I think we talked about it a little bit on the podcast, where he talks about the Old Testament never really talking about saving one's soul. And so he's looking at what Christianity has become and then going back to the Bible and trying to think about what the Bible actually says. And I think that's an interesting exercise even today in a lot of the issues that the church is wrestling with. And so many times we think we know what the Bible says about X, Y, and Z. And then you go back and read the Bible, and it's got all of these different ways of speaking about these different issues. And he's looking at the Old Testament, and he's thinking about how salvation in the Old Testament was this worldly. It was never about dying and going to some heaven. It was about a God who comes to the people of Israel in Egypt and frees them from the oppression of Pharaoh and brings them into the promised land. Takes them from Egypt and brings them to the promised land. Even he talks in the one of the paragraphs here. He's talking about Sheol and Hades, not as kind of metaphysical categories, not as kind of eternal, transcendent categories, but a shadowy existence of things that have existed here on earth. And there's this kind of shadow realm. And so he's looking at the Old Testament and he's saying that the Old Testament is not what he refers to as the redemption myth. It is not about getting beyond the boundary of death, that death is this boundary that the redemption myths are always trying to overcome. And what he's arguing here is that in the Old Testament, that is not the focal point. That whatever salvation means, whatever redemption means, it is always this worldly. And then he goes on to talk about how Christianity has become this kind of redemption myth. And so let me read here just a little bit. This is Bonhoeffer. It is said to be decisive that in Christianity, the hope of the resurrection is proclaimed, and that in this way, a genuine religion of redemption has come into being. Now the emphasis is on that which is beyond death's boundary. So Christianity is seen as this redemption myth in which the whole focal point of resurrection is about overcoming death. It's about this eternal, transcendent overcoming. And I want you to listen to what he says here in the next line. And precisely here is where I see the error and the danger. Redemption now means being redeemed out of sorrows, hardships, anxieties, and longings, out of sin and death, in a better life beyond. But should this really be the essence of the proclamation of Christ in the Gospels and Paul? I dispute this. In other words, Bonhoeffer sees how Christianity has become about overcoming that boundary of death, of suffering, and so on, into a world that is beyond, a transcendent world. And so that Christianity has become a redemption myth. And what he's arguing is this is a wrong reading of the Gospels and of Paul. He's disputing it. He goes on, the Christian hope of resurrection is different from the mythological. and that it refers people to their life on earth in a wholly new way and more sharply than the Old Testament. So what he's arguing is the Gospels and the message of Christianity has much more in common with the Old Testament. In fact, what he's saying is it's even stronger than that Old Testament emphasis upon redemption being this worldly. And he's arguing that the Christian hope of resurrection is not about getting beyond the boundary of death. It's not about this transcendent heavenly place that we get to go. It's not about the saving of our souls so that when we die, our souls can go to heaven. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is about the transformation of life in this world. He goes on. Unlike believers in the redemption myths, Christians do not have an ultimate escape route out of their earthly tasks and difficulties into eternity. So it's so interesting when you think about contemporary evangelical Christianity, or just Christianity in general in the West anyway. There's this emphasis upon the saving of our souls and almost an escapist, we're leaving this world behind. The things of this world do not matter, and we'll be going to a better place, this transcendent place. And Bonhoeffer is saying no, that the primary message of Christianity is about being freed and transformed as the new humanity of Jesus Christ, to live in this world. And it's not an escape route from our earthly tasks and difficulties into some eternity. So again, he is opposed to religion in this kind of metaphysical context. Religion represents abstraction, that we're being pulled away from the historical, we're being pulled away from the temporal and our concrete kind of historical existence here in this world to some kind of abstract metaphysical world of beyond. This is what Bonhoeffer is opposed to. And this is what religionless Christianity or religionless faith is also opposed to. He goes on. Like Christ, and then he has the quote from Christ from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? They have to drink the cup of earthly life to the last drop. And only when they do this is the crucified and risen one with them. And they are crucified and resurrected with Christ. This worldliness must not be abolished ahead of its time. On this, the New Testament and Old Testament are united. Redemption myths arise from the human experience of boundaries, but Christ takes hold of human beings in the midst of their lives. So again, he keeps coming back to this idea of pushing God to the boundary. That's what religion wants to do. And it sets up this false dichotomy of this world and this transcendent world to come. And what he's arguing is that religion is continually pushing God and Christ to that boundary, that Christianity is not fundamentally about saving our souls so we can die and go to some transcendent place. It is about the transformation of our humanity in and for this world and in this life. It is to live as a human being and to take seriously the earthly tasks and difficulties as he's speaking here. Now, down the road, we're going to switch and we're going to begin looking at Kierkegaard. And I think here we see Bonhoeffer is influenced by Kierkegaard. So you get this line from Luther to Kierkegaard. I would argue also then through Nietzsche. So I had somebody is, responding to the podcast, which is great. And again, I welcome all questions and points that are being made, kind of being critical in the sense of from a Nietzschean perspective, without really, I think, even using Nietzsche's name, referring to Christians as sheep and Christianity kind of referencing this the sheepishness of humanity, which you find in Nietzsche. And my response is that Bonhoeffer, one of his favorite conversation partners is Nietzsche. If you read Bonhoeffer, his other works especially, you will find that he's referencing Nietzsche. Now, he doesn't agree with Nietzsche on everything, But you find these influences of Nietzsche. And this is where I think from Luther to Kierkegaard through Nietzsche into Bonhoeffer, we find this emphasis on living as a human being and taking seriously our human life, of living, of leaning into the unknown, of taking seriously our struggles and our sufferings and our anxieties, but having all of those things transformed now in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which frees us from these kind of ideological impulses, these abstractions. This is, I think, the power of what Bonhoeffer has to say to the contemporary church and contemporary Christianity. And I would make this claim. I think this is why a lot of young people are leaving the church and leaving Christianity. Because the church and Christianity, the message they're receiving, it's never addressing their lived experience. It's never a gospel that is for this world. It is always this sense of trust in God, believe in God. When you die, you will go to heaven and you will have eternal peace. There are things that are higher than this world. And what Bonhoeffer is doing is flipping that around and saying, no, the death and resurrection of Christ is about being transformed into the new humanity of Christ, to live in this world and to be for this world and to take this world very seriously. And I wonder if ministry and the preaching of the gospel actually addressed the lived experiences of others. What difference would that make? Now, what's interesting, I've also had this accusation thrown at me, that it's just a veiled version of liberation theology and so on. And look, I'm really interested in Gustavo Gutierrez, and I have students read James Cone, a Black Theology. I think there's things to learn in feminist theology. So trying to throw that label at me with this liberation theology, it doesn't really do much, because I think there's a lot in Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff and others that are saying something similar to Bonhoeffer in saying, what difference does the gospel make for this world? In many ways, and you can see this, in the Catholic Church in Central America, where Gutierrez is arguing that they're aligning themselves with the power structures. And it makes total sense that if Christianity is about dying, going to some abstract heaven and escapism, then yeah, this world doesn't matter. Like, you accept your lot in this world, you do the best you can, and you will build up your treasures in heaven. And so what that does is this world remains unchanged. That's a big part of what Gustavo Gutierrez and Boff and all of them are doing. And I think Bonhoeffer is tapping into that as well. And what it does is it opens up the gospel and Christianity to being co-opted by the powers of this world, the forces of this world. And I think we can see that play out in a whole wide variety of political perspectives, that it gets used to just justify the status quo. And what I believe a Kierkegaardian and kind of Bonhoeffer perspective does, a religionless Christianity does, is it's always asking the question about ideology. And it's always being willing to challenge the status quo and the way in which the power structures exist. And what exactly is the gospel about? It is about liberation from sin and death, but it is about that in the context of this existence and in this world. Now, Bonhoeffer is not saying that there isn't a life to come. That's not what he's doing. But what he's saying is, if you go back and read the Old Testament and you read the New Testament, it is very much about this world, about this creation. You go back to Genesis 1 and you read about how the creation itself is the temple of God and humans are the high priests. I mean, it's always about God dwelling with creation, which takes this creation very seriously. And here, what Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity is trying to do is challenge the ways in which Christianity and the church can become co-opted to simply affirm the status quo and the power structures of this world. And he's suggesting that no, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ empowers us now to live as human beings in this world and to take this world and take this life seriously. Again, I would just simply say, what would it be like if the church began to speak into the lived experiences of people and recognize the ways in which the gospel of Jesus Christ is a proclamation of life in this world and for this world. And this is going to open up now in a bunch of different letters that are coming, a deeper conversation about this idea of what does it mean for Christ to be at the center of human life, and what does that look like for the church? And very quickly, I want to say this doesn't have anything to do with liturgy or worship or whatever. So for people who would hear this idea of religionless Christianity, mean like we don't like the church or we want to get rid of the church, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is we can continue to use all of this archaic language that doesn't mean anything anymore to anybody. But what's going to happen is people are going to be pushed away. And he's asking for the interpretive task of the church to say, who is Jesus Christ for today? And how now does the gospel speak to the lived experience of people? So from this letter, we'll move into some of these other letters where he begins to ask that question a little more deeply. What is it? Who is Jesus Christ for us today?